So I'm actually going to talk about marine renewable energy, but before I do that, I've got to go with the ubiquitous slide that you've seen today already. So those of you here this morning, this wasn't set up. We all took the same picture off the internet. So if someone had a patent on this, obviously we'd make lots of money. The reason why I put this up here, though, is obviously to join in with all the other descriptions of ecological resilience and regime shift. But what I'm going to focus on really is thinking about the shape of these basins and what's going on in the ball, in effect, the system. And the reason for that is that if I'd had time and if I was allowed to get a marker pen out, I'd actually draw another sort of plausible different types of basins here, because what I'm going to talk about is something which we're sort of promoting as being new in the environment, which we haven't had before. And so therefore we don't actually know what the shape of the basin is, how deep it is, how steep-sided it is, and also we need to understand the elements that go into the ball to determine how it might respond. So it's a really exciting area. It's very new, but that's where this kind of fits into the general principles. But before I do that, I want to try and illustrate two elements of ecological resilience that to help contextualize what we're talking about when it comes to marine energy. And this is really how we perceive the changes to the ecosystems through something like either an acute or a chronic regime shift. Now this is essentially the 2010 Deepwater Horizon BP, the biggest oil disaster that we've had on the planet so far. This was the effects in the Gulf of Mexico of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And straight away, thinking about whether the system is resilient or not, these are the kinds of pictures that we saw. So mass fish kills, obviously the oiling of birds, the local coasts being oiled up. And straight away, that was sort of being portrayed as the whole system is going to be completely affected. Is this actually a regime shift we're going to end up with? We also had sort of the link with the sort of socioeconomic and socio-ecological arena, where there was statewide and federal-wide closures of fishing, so affecting the local communities who utilised the Gulf of Mexico area obviously for fishing, either for commercial purposes or for recreational purposes. So obviously we've got effects on the ecological system and the social system, but the perception was that this is going to be a real disaster. 5 years on, people are now saying, oh, the system's resilient. Now the water is a lot clearer. The beaches don't look like that anymore. So therefore, we haven't had that shift, that regime shift. However, that hasn't taken account of things like the longer term, the chronic potential regime shifts. This is where in the original diagram, you've got the basin shallowing. And this is interesting because if you look in a bit more detail at this, the Deepwater Horizon situation, we've still got remnants, particularly along the coastal area, in the salt marshes, etc., of the oil that's been spilt. It's still there and still causing effects. We've got, this is lots of the oil that they calculated they'd lost, they couldn't account for, and a lot of this is actually still underwater on the seabed or in different levels of the sea, so we've got some potential continued source of oil. We then get, again, some more sort of emotive things coming out now, which is mutant seafood. And the reason for that is a lot of the fish are turning up with sort of lesions and sort of damages to the side, which obviously has a problem for the fishing community. The shrimps, which is a big thing in gumbo and things like that, the shrimps have got no eyes, some of them have got no eyes, some of their gills are blocked up with various oiling products. And so we're also getting more sort of longer-term ecological potential factors creating a determination of whether we've got a regime shift. For instance, here, the bluefin tuna, which is something which, again, is big for commercial and recreational fishing. They've been finding that these animals have got physiological problems that have come about, which they've linked to the oil spill. And also here, if you can just make out, these are larvae of bluefin tuna, and you can see the one on the left-hand side is the control, and the one on the right-hand side is a deformed larval bluefin tuna, which is oil exposed. So the question here is the system resilient? Has there been a regime shift, or how long do we have to wait for it to occur? And so I think we can, depending on what evidence we look at, we can change the shape of the basin and the height of the sides. So that's all relevant to what I'm going to talk about, which is another use of the environment that we've got on the coast. Now, obviously, this is just a list of a lot of the things that we currently do in the marine environment. It's not a pristine environment, even though we can't see underneath the surface very easily. It's not. We do a lot of changes to it. Some of those changes have caused some serious regime shifts, particularly fishing. Is I think the figure I saw was something like 60% of some of the systems have been affected quite severely through fishing. It's one of the biggest impacts. And all of these are changing things, changing essentially the sort of parameters that define our basins. But this is not meant to be a sort of a doom and gloom story. What this is where the new dawn came from, is this idea that we're going to use the marine environment, and we are using it now, in a way to help us with the global issue of carbon emissions and fossil fuels. So that should be a good thing. But we've also got the scale issue. We've got a global versus the local changes that are occurring when we put things like, for instance, wind farms out there. I'm talking mainly about wind farms, but the context is meant to be any marine renewable energy, really. But wind farms are the ones which we've got the most sort of evidence from, and most of the activity, particularly in Northern Europe, that are leading the world. Just to illustrate that, the scene going forward is that we're going to have more wind farms out in the oceans. Huge amount of potential there, and it's going to become a major economic driver. It's going to change things like, upskilling. It's going to change the way that communities utilize existing facilities, such as port facilities. And so there's a whole new sort of arena out there, which is going to change a lot of what we do. Slightly slower pace behind, but still, particularly in the context of the UK, we've got major resources in terms of wave, in terms of tidal stream, and particularly pertinent to Cardiff is the Tidal Barrage idea, which is potentially providing a huge resource, a huge renewable resource in Wales and on the other parts in the northwest of England. And there are decisions being made to actually harness these, and we are moving forward on a number of these principles. Certainly down here, just recently, a couple of weeks ago, the Isle of Wight Council gave permission for a new tidal array to be developed. So it's happening all the time. And the question that we're coming at from is, well, how is this going to potentially change? This is a new dawn for the marine environment. And the reason I'm saying that is if you look at the spatial scale of what's going on. So this is focusing on wind farms, but here we've got the activity in the southern North Sea and mainly and around the UK. And we're not the only ones that are doing it. The UK is not the only ones. Obviously, all our neighbours are doing it. So we've got a huge amount of change going on. These areas, are not insignificant. And given that we've already done lots of stuff to the environment, what does this mean for the marine ecosystem? And also within that, and this links in a bit to what Ruth was talking about, and also some of the other talks, we've got the infrastructure in relation to electricity. That's what we're trying to generate. How is that going to get moved around? The idea of Britain being a net exporter of energy because of renewable energy is a completely new domain. We're normally bringing it into this country. So again, we've got lots of infrastructure going into the marine environment associated with this development. So there's a lot of stuff going to be going on. That's on a fairly big scale. Look on a local scale, and this is just a picture of a normal wind farm. We've got obviously multiple devices being put into the seabed or around the seabed. They're all interconnected in terms of cables. We might have substations. Lots of infrastructure going in, and lots of potential change occurring. So I mean, the biggest wind farm at the moment is several hundred square kilometres of seabed, if you include the cable network as well as the extremes of the sites. That's the environmental footprint. These are big areas. Now, one of the things that people talk about is, well, if this area is going to be designated as the marine renewable energy development area, then that could have significant effects such as things like fishing, because fishermen are not going to want to go in there. In some parts of Europe, fishermen are not allowed in there. In the UK, we're not allowed within a certain distance of the turbines, but any sane fisherman won't go in there because their gear is going to cost too much if it gets caught up. So then there's ideas about these acting as de facto marine protected areas or no fishing zones. So all these things that we're trying to implement in other parts of the ocean, maybe, and this is the question in defining the basin, maybe they could be having some potential benefit. But the key here is that a lot of what we're doing when we're looking at this is looking for problems, whereas where we think there might be a benefit, we're just assuming that. We're not actually going out and measuring that. And that's something that probably needs to change. There's a bit of a shift. Also importantly is, if we're talking about our basins and everything else, is those basins may not stay the same shape through time, particularly if we're talking about the different phases of activity. So for instance, if we've got the construction phase, which relatively speaking in the life cycle of say an offshore wind farm is only 2 or 3 years, whereas the operational time is somewhere in the region of 30 years. So there's different things to think about there. Is the changes that are occurring in our environment here, such as lots of noise, lots of activity, building work, lots of metal going in, etc., as opposed to the sort of the more benign time when things are operating. But there's still things going on there that we're not really aware about or haven't really quantified in any way. So in order to try and do this, a few years back, myself and a professor from Oregon State University sort of sat down and thought about this. And we took a sort of the idea of the sort of source pathway receptor kind of approach to try and break this down and think about, well, where are we and where do we need to go? And so the idea here is this framework is that we have define our marine renewable energy. If you work your way down, you've got your what's called stressors, because that's the terminology. I don't like the word because it has the negative connotations. But environmental changes, if you like. We have receptors, things that are going to receive that change. And we have an effect that could be short-term, it could be acute, it could be multiple, it could be single, or it could be chronic, long-term. And we thought that this was worth sort of defining in terms of how we see the changes that might occur to the ecosystem. And the other thing which is really important is we made a distinction between effect and impact. And the reason being is that effects are what we go out and measure. We go and see whether a bird's going to fly into a turbine. We go and see whether dolphins are going to respond to pile driving noise. We're seeing changes maybe in distribution or change in flight path or swimming. That's an effect. But what we really want to know is what is the biologically relevant impact? What's the ecological consequences of it? So this is where we're getting down to the idea of things like processes that are occurring. We talked about this before as well earlier on, that processes are sort of at the heart of how the ecosystem is going to respond. So we think it's really important to try and move further down this chain, because that then takes you down to the idea of cumulative aspects, which everybody's really trying to sort of nail at the moment. So just to try and provide a framework, I'm going to illustrate it through two things. One is more specific, and that's the one in the corner here, which is looking at energy emission, which we work on underwater noise and also electromagnetic fields going into the environment. So that's quite a specific thing. And then the other one is this physical presence of the devices, just to try and see whether we can kind of make some kind of predictions about where the ecosystem might go and how it might change. This idea of electromagnetic fields is something which is fairly poorly understood. In fact, a lot of people have dismissed it because we don't detect it ourselves. But the idea is that we are putting, or we can model electricity generation through cables, which is this picture in the middle here, and we can actually demonstrate that there should be these things in the water. And the question that people keep coming up with is that going to be a potentially significant effector on a receptor? And so you can end up with these sort of montages of things going on the seabed that we don't really kind of compute very well. The other thing is that we live in an electromagnetic world. We have the geomagnetic field, which is fundamental to many, many organisms on the planet. And also, as humans, we are changing that environment as well. There's also been talk about a link with the climate change and various other things, but there's a lot of it around at the moment. We're surrounded by it. You produce your own fields as well. The other thing that's interesting, talking earlier on about the idea that you can predict these things, but actually we don't know are they actually out there. So we finished a European project last year where we actually went out to wind farms to say, well, we predicted, are they there? And yes, they are there, but actually they're there and they're more prevalent. They extend further than the models tell us. So this is where actually understanding the data, the real data, as was mentioned before, in terms of the heating, is an important part of this. Why is it important? Well, and we managed to get a link to the microbes, these are bacteria. So from bacteria to the blue whale, these organisms can detect the electromagnetic fields. So we have a huge number. We're the kind of only organisms that don't really detect these in particularly any great way that we know of. But why is that important? It's important because a lot of the organisms use it naturally to find their way around the planet, to find their way and interact with ecosystems, whether that's locally or whether that's over large-scale migrations, for instance, or local orientation or finding of food. And we've been looking at a number of different species here, the migratory species like the eel, species of sharks and rays, which are important commercially, and also species of lobsters which migrate. But we've not been studying these guys here, but that's relevant because a lot of the research and some of the answers for this are going to take a while to come out with, so these guys might be the people looking at it in the future rather than us. But we're trying to understand this sort of, these are the receptors and how they might respond. Now the only issue with that is you're focusing on one element of the whole system that's in the basin. And so we end up going down this route, trying to look at the biological relevance of things. And this is a model that's been used for looking at acoustic disturbance to marine mammals, and where you're trying to get the relevance of a change, of a response by an animal, and looking at it in terms of the population effects, which is what's going to feed into the ecosystems. And so you get, again, the negative connotations of disturbance. You might have a physiological change, as in, for instance, the tuna I talked about before. A behavior change, you might have an acute or a chronic effect, and that might change things for the individuals. Depends on how many individuals are going to be affected, is whether that's going to affect things like vital rates, the population sort of demographics, and how that's going to affect at the end. This is a useful sort of context to try and look at the source pathway receptor model. But what we want to be able to do is ensure that change of population is then built into sort of a community kind of response, so that if that population changes, how does the rest of the community alter? And that's where it comes into the sort of if you want, the more positive side of things, which is how the changes are going to occur through the physical presence of these devices. So what I've done is I've just put some pictures here. So we've got our environment here, which is the open sea, and we're putting these things in the water. To look at it in slightly more detail, this is looking at it from the changes to habitat, changes to the physical nature. We've got different elements of the ecosystem which are going to be populated by different organisms. Put these devices in, and what we're seeing already is we're getting changes to the actual structure there. We've actually gone from almost a sort of a very, very open water environment to a hard bottom environment. That's very, very different. It's not something that we've done before to the scale that we've done now. We've done it with sort of the odd oil platform, for instance, but we've got lots of these. We've got hundreds of these things going in, thousands in the water. So we're going to get changes locally in terms of the physical environment and the potential habitat for the organisms. So likewise, if we look at how things are before you put these in, we might have a situation where we've got organisms that are interacting with the benthos, the seabed. We've got those organisms floating around in the water column that are utilizing that, and there's an ecosystem there. And then we get a situation where we've got, say, wind farms going in, and we've got colonization, we've got sort of a build-up of a new ecosystem in effect, because these are hard bottom species which wouldn't normally be in a soft bottom environment. So again, if we look at this more in a kind of a process-based and sort of ecosystem-based idea, we can break that down into these. And don't worry about the detail. Really, all it is that there's lots of these interconnections. And this is what I'm saying is we've got to remember that the system is all functioning together, and we've got decomposition, we've got fish utilizing those resources, and they're eating things off the bottom. They're being eaten by predators, and then birds are eating, etc. But then when we've put the hard structures in, then how's that going to change? And this is just a speculative diagram coming out. And the point here is that we've got more connections. The sizes of these circles is meant to represent the biomass, the numbers, the abundance. That's going to change as well. And so we're going to get, and we've actually got a system which has now got a littoral zone that never had it before. So we've actually got seaweeds growing in places that never would grow before. We've got marine insects out at sea. And marine insects are not very popular, there's not many of them about. And we're finding them in the splash zone. So we're getting changes, significant changes occurring, but it was very early days. So this is the sort of the idea that we are going to get a significant change, and is that going to be a change in the basin, and is it going to be significant to have a regime shift or not? I suppose is the question there. And just to sort of wind this up, obviously there's lots of questions out there, but the way that we've been trying to utilize this is thinking about the idea of environmental risk to make decisions about whether we should put these devices in or not. And obviously you can look at that from the global benefit of having offshore renewable energy, and you can look at it from the local changes that are going to occur that I've just sort of illustrated. And the way we've been trying to do that is to talk to people about, well, what's the risk? What are you willing to accept in terms of change? And frame that in environmental risk, but particularly environmental risk and the uncertainty. The uncertainty comes about by our lack of the knowledge. And so we're trying to collect some of those data to help reduce that uncertainty, to improve the ability to determine whether this is a risk in terms of a change, a regime shift, whether we want it or not, and help with the assessment of how we can move forward with what potentially could be a positive change to the environment. And we're also doing this through sort of training courses, short courses, etc. So this is just the pitch on things that we're trying to do to try and engage with the different sectors, right across from the people putting these in to the regulatory agencies, to the academics, to try and understand the elements that we need to be considering when we're thinking about the changes that are going to occur through putting these in the water. So just to finish off, the idea of the changes that may occur in terms of the marine environment in relation to renewable energy. There's going to be change. We're already seeing the change, but it's very early days. So I would say that we can't really say that it's a good or a bad thing at the moment locally, but if you take into account other things like stopping of fishing, etc., then maybe this is something that is good, but we need to demonstrate that, not just say it. We need to go out and collect that information and demonstrate that. So there's going to be changes. Might be that chronic, longer-term changes may be the thing we need to look at more than these acute changes, which we know are more emotive to people and people tend to focus on. Think about positive outcomes as well as negative outcomes, if there are any. We've got lots of policies and legal instruments that we have to follow, such as the Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, but that focuses us down on the negatives again. We need to be maybe thinking about, is there any way to demonstrate that this is a positive environmental impact? You know, it might seem slightly oxymoron in terms of having impact and positive, but you can actually have them. And then the other thing is, we'll not be able to understand any of this because there's a huge amount of complexity in this. We need to have this collaborative approach going in and targeting particular elements, particular questions, and having different people helping collect those data. And the final thing really is monitoring data is crucial to get that baseline, so to continue to collect the data that we need in order to help understand whether we will have a regime shift or not.
Good, for almost keeping to time.
Almost, sorry.
No, that's good. So is there any, oh yes.